Hello, guys and gals, and this is part 19 of our reading of George Orwell's 1984. Um, but yeah, in the last episode, there was a lot going on with Hate Week, and Winston basically got the briefcase with the Goldstein book in it, so he's about to read it. That's basically all you missed out on if you didn't see the last episode. Also, O'Brien quizzed them on as to how far they'd go, for the cause and stuff. And O'Brien explained to them there wasn't going to be any hope or anything like that of them being rescued if they were caught, when they were caught. Okay, so a heavy black volume, amateurishly bound with no name or title on the cover. The print also looked slightly irregular. The pages were worn at the edges and fall apart easily, as though the book had passed through many hands. The inscription on the title page ran, "The Theory and Practice of Oligarchical Collectivism." By Emmanuel Goldstein. Winston began reading. Chapter 1. Ignorance is Strength. Throughout recorded time, and probably since the end of the Neolithic era, there have been three kinds of people in the world: the high, the middle, and the low. They have been subdivided in many ways, and have borne countless different names, and their relative numbers, as well as their attitudes towards one another, have varied from age to age, but the essential structure of society has never altered, even after enormous upheavals and seemingly irrevocable changes. The same pattern has always reasserted itself, just as a gyroscope will always return to equilibrium, however far it is pushed one way or the other. The aims of these three groups are entirely interconcilable. Okay, now wait. Before we do this, it occurs to me that I didn't go over the copyright information. This is a 1961 copy of the book, and says all rights reserved, including the right to reproduce this book in any form. So, with that being said, we're going to continue. Sorry for breaking the magic. Winston stopped reading chiefly in order to appreciate the fact that he was reading in comfort and safety. He was alone. No telescreen, no ear at the keyhole, no nervous impulse to glance over his shoulder or cover the page with his hand. The sweet summer air played against his cheek. From somewhere far away there floated the faint shouts of children. In the room itself there was no sound, except the insect voice of the clock. He settled deeper into the armchair and put his feet up on the fender. It was bliss. It was eternity. Suddenly, as one sometimes does with a book in which he knows that one will ultimately read and reread every word, he opened it to a different place and found himself at the third chapter. He went on reading. Chapter 3. War is Peace. The splitting up of the world into three great super-states was an event which could be, and indeed was, foreseen before the middle of the 20th century. With the absorption of Europe by Russia and the British empires by the United States, two of the three existing powers, Eurasia and Oceania, were already effectively in being. The third, East Asia, only emerged as a district unit after another decade of confused fighting. The frontiers between the three superstates are in some places arbitrary, and in others they fluctuate according to the fortunes of war. But in general they allow geological lines. Eurasia comprises the whole of the northern part of the European and Asiatic landmass, from Portugal to the Bering Strait. Oceania comprises the Americas, the Atlantic Islands, including the British Isles, Australasia, and the southern portion of Africa. East Asia, smaller than the others and with a less definite western frontier, comprises China and the countries to the south of it, the Japanese islands, and the large but fluctuating portion of Manchuria, Mongolia, and Tibet. In one combination or another, these three super states are permanently at war and have been so for the past 25 years. War, however, is no longer the desperate, annihilating struggle that it was in the early decades of the 20th century. It is a warfare of limited aims between combatants who are unable to destroy one another, have no material cause for fighting, and are not divided by any genuine ideological difference. This is not to say that either the conduct of war or the prevailing attitude towards it have become less bloodthirsty or more chivalrous. On the contrary, war hysteria is continuous and universal in all countries, and such acts as raping, looting, and slaughter of children, the reduction of whole populations in slavery, and reprisals against prisoners, which extend even to the boiling and burying alive, are looked upon as normal, and when they are committed by one's own side and not by the enemy, meritorious. But in a physical sense, war involves very small numbers of people, mostly highly trained specialists, and causes comparatively few casualties. The fighting, when there is any, takes place on the vague frontiers whose whereabouts the average man can only guess at, or round the floating fortresses which guard strategic spots on the sea lanes. In the center of civilization, war means no more than a continuous shortage of consumption goods, and the occasional crash of the crash of a rocket bomb, which may cause a few scores of deaths. War has in fact changed its character. More exactly, the reasons for which war is waged have changed in their order of importance. Motives which were already present to some small extent in the great wars of the early 20th century have now become dominant and are consciously recognized and acted upon. To understand the nature of the present war, for in spite of the regrouping which occurs every few years, it is always the same war. One must realize, in the first place, that it is impossible for it to be decisive. None of the three superpowers, the superstates rather, could be definitely conquered, even by the other two in combination. They are too evenly matched, and their natural defenses are too formidable. Eurasia is protected by its vast land spaces, Oceania by the width of the Atlantic and the Pacific, East Asia by the fecundity and the industriousness of its inhabitants. Secondly, there is no longer, in a material sense, anything to fight about. With the establishment of self-contained economies in which production and consumption are geared to one another, the scramble of markets, which was a main cause of previous wars, has come to an end, while the competition for raw resources is no longer a matter of life and death. In any case, each of the three superstates is so vast that it can obtain almost all of the materials that it needs within its own boundaries. Insofar as the war has a direct economic purpose, it is a war for labor power between the frontiers of the superstates, and not permanently in the possession of any of them. There lies a rough quadrilateral with its corners at Tangier, Brazzaville, Darwin, and Hong Kong, containing within it about a fifth of the population of the earth. It is for the possession of these thickly populated regions and of the northern ice caps that the three powers are constantly struggling. In practice, no one power ever controls the whole of the distributed area. The disputed area rather. Portions of it are constantly changing hands, and it is the chance of seizure of seizing this or that fragment by a sudden stroke of treachery that dictates the endless changes of alignment. All of the disputed territories contain valuable minerals, minerals, and some of them yield important vegetable products such as rubber, which in colder climates is a necessity to synthesize by comparatively expensive methods. But above all, they contain a bottomless reserve of cheap labor. Whichever power controls equatorial Africa or the countries of the Middle East or southern India or the Indonesian archipelago disposes also of the bodies of scores of hundreds of millions of ill-paid and hard-working coolies. The inhabitants of these areas, reduced more or less openly to the status of slaves, pass continually from conqueror to conqueror, and are expended like so much coal or oil in the race to turn out more armaments, to capture more territory, to control more labor power, to turn out more armaments, to capture more territory, and so on, indefinitely. It should be noted that the fighting never really moves beyond the edges of the disputed areas. The frontiers of Eurasia flow back and forth between the basin of the Congo and the northern shores of the Mediterranean. The islands of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific are constantly being captured and recaptured by Oceania or by East Asia. In Mongolia, the dividing line between Eurasia and East Asia is never stable. Round the pole, all three powers lay claim to enormous territories, which in fact are largely uninhabited and unexplored, but the balance of power always remains roughly even, and the territory which forms the heartland of each superstate also remains inviolate. Moreover, the labor of the exploited peoples round the equator is not really necessary to the world's economy. They add nothing to the wealth of the world, since whatever they produce is used for purposes of war, and the object of waging war is always to be in a better position in which to wage another war. But their labor and slave population allows the tempo of continuous warfare to be speeded up. But if they did not exist, the structure of the world society and the process by which it maintains itself would not be essentially different. The primary aim of modern warfare, in accordance to the principles of doublethink, this aim is simultaneously recognized and recognized by the directing brain of the inner party. It is to use up the products of the machine without raising the general standards of living. Ever since the end of the 19th century, the problem of what to do with the surplus of consumption goods has been latent in industrial society. At present, when few human beings even have enough to eat, this problem is obviously not urgent, and it might not become so even if no artificial process of destruction had been at work. The world of today is a bare, hungry, dilapidated place compared with the world that existed before 1914, and still more so if compared with the imaginary future of which the people of the period looked forward. In the early 20th century, the vision of the future society, unbelievably rich, leisured, ordered, and efficient, a glittering antiseptic world of glass and steel and snow-white concrete was part of the consciousness of nearly every literate person. Science and technology were developing at a prodigious speed, and it seemed natural to assume that they would go on developing. This failed to happen partly because of the impoverishment caused by a long series of wars and revolutions, partly because scientific and technological process depends on the empirical habit of thought, which could not survive in a strictly regimented society. As a whole, the world is more primitive today than it was 50 years ago. Certain backward areas have advanced in various devices, always in some way connected with warfare and police espionage, have been developed, but experiment and invention have largely stopped, and the ravages of the atomic war of the 1950s had never been fully repaired. Nevertheless, the dangers inherent in the machine are still there. For the moment when the machine first made its appearance, it was clear to a thinking person that the need for human drudgery, and therefore to a greater extent for human inequality, had disappeared. If the machine was used deliberately for that end, hunger, overwork, dirt, illiteracy, and disease could be eliminated within a few generations, and in fact, without being used for any such purpose, but by a sort of automatic process, by producing wealth, which it was sometimes impossible not to distribute, the machine did raise the living standards of the average human being very greatly over a period of about 50 years at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th centuries. But it was also clear that an all-around increase in wealth threatened the destruction, indeed in some sense was the destruction, of the hierarchical society, in a world in which everyone worked short hours and had enough to eat, lived in a house with a bathroom and a refrigerator, and possessed a motor car, or even an airplane. The most obvious and perhaps the most important form of inequality would already have disappeared if it once became general. If it once became general, wealth would confer no distinction. It was possible, no doubt, to imagine a society in which wealth, in the sense of personal possessions and luxuries, should be evenly distributed, while power remained in the hands of a small privileged caste. But in practice, such a society could not long remain stable. Stable. For if leisure and security were enjoyed by all alike, the great mass of human beings who are normally stupefied by poverty would become literate and would learn to think for themselves. And when once they had done this, they would sooner or later realize that the privileged minority had no function, and they would sweep it away. In the long run, a hierarchical society was only possible on a basis of poverty and ignorance. To return to the agricultural past, as some thinkers about the beginning of the 20th century dreamed of doing, was not a practical solution. It conflicted with the tendency towards mechanization, which had become quasi-instinctive throughout almost the whole world, and moreover, any country which remained industrially backwards was helpless in a military sense, and was bound to be dominated, directly or indirectly, by its more advanced rivals. Nor was it a satisfactory solution to keep the masses in poverty by restricting the output of goods. This happened to a great extent during the final phase of capitalism. Roughly between 1920 and 1940, the economy of many countries was allowed to stagnate. Land went out of cultivation. Capital equipment was not added to. Great blocks of the population were prevented from working and kept half alive by state charity. But this, too, entailed military weakness. And since the privations it inflicted were obviously unnecessary, it made opposition inevitable. The problem was how to keep the wheels of industry turning without increasing the real wealth of the world. Goods must be produced, but they need not be distributed, and in practice, the only way of achieving this was with continuous warfare. The essential act of war is destruction. The essential act of war is destruction, not necessarily of human lives, but of the products of human labor. War is a way of shattering to pieces or pouring into the stratosphere or sinking into the depths of the sea materials which might otherwise be used to make the masses too comfortable, and hence, in the long run, too intelligent. Even when weapons of war are not actually destroyed, their manufacture is still a convenient way of expending labor power without producing anything that can be consumed. A floating fortress, for example, has locked up in it the labor that would build several hundred cargo ships. Ultimately, it is scrapped as obsolete, never having thought no, never having brought any material benefit to anybody, and with further enormous labor another floating fortress is built. In principle, the war effort is always so planned as to eat up any surplus that might exist after meeting the bare needs of the population. In practice, the needs of the population are always underestimated, with the result that there is a chronic shortage of half the necessities of life, but this is looked on as an advance. It is deliberate policy to keep even the favored groups somewhere near the brink of hardship, because a general state of scarcity increases the importance of small privileges and thus magnifies the distinction between one group and another. By the standards of the early 20th century, even the members of the inner party lives are lives an austere, laborious kind of life. Nevertheless, the few luxuries that he does enjoy, his large, well-appointed flat, the better texture of his clothes, the better quality of his food, food and drink and tobacco, his 2 or 3 servants, his private motor car or helicopter, set him in a different world from a member of the outer party, and the members of the outer party have a similar advantage in comparison with the submerged masses whom we call the proles. The social atmosphere is that of a besieged city where the possession of a lump of horseflesh makes the difference between wealth and poverty, and at the same time the consequences of being at war and therefore in danger makes the handing over of all power to a small castle seem the natural unavoidable condition of survival. War, it will it will be seen, not only accomplishes the necessary destruction, but accomplishes it in a psychologically acceptable way. The principle, it would be quite simple to waste the surplus labor. Oh, wait. In principle, it would be quite simple to waste the surplus labor of the world by building temples and pyramids, by digging holes and filling them up again, or even by producing vast quantities of goods and then setting fire to them. But this would provide only the economic and not the emotional basis for hierarchical society. When it what is concerned here is not the morale of the masses, whose attitude is unimportant so long as they are kept steadily at work, but the morale of the party itself. Even the humblest party member is expected to be competent, industrious, and even intelligent within narrow limits, but it is also necessary that he should be a credulous and ignorant fanatic whose prevailing moods are fear, hatred, adulation, and orgiastic triumph. In other words, it is necessary that he should have the mentality appropriate to a state of war. It does not matter whether the war is actually happening, and since no decisive victory is possible, it does not matter whether the war is going well or badly. All that is needed is that a state of war should exist. The splitting of the intelligence which the party requires of its members, and which is more easily achieved in an atmosphere of war, is now almost universal. But the higher up the ranks one goes, the more marked it becomes. It is precisely in the inner party that the war hysteria and hatred of the enemy are strongest. It, in his capacity as an administrator, it is often necessary for a member of the inner party to know that this or that item of war news is untruthful, and he may often be aware that the entire war is spurious and is either not happening or is being waged for purposes quite other than the declared ones. But such knowledge is easily neutralized by the technique of doublethink. Meanwhile, no inner party member wavers for an instant in his mythical belief that the war is real and that it is bound to end victoriously with Oceania and the undisputed master of the entire world. Wow, this is long. I don't know if I have time to read the rest of this, so we're going to stop this right here at 159. We didn't get through very many pages, but this is a lot of reading. I don't think that we have time to read the remaining paragraph. So, anyways, we have been reading from George Orwell's 1984, or rather 1984 by George Orwell. If you like this content, make sure you like and subscribe and ring the bell so you know when I upload. And if you want to support me in any way, all that information will be in the description below. As always, thanks for watching, everyone, and have a great day.